book of Genesis. We're going to be in Genesis 21 this morning. We're going to finish the chapter. 21 verses 22 through 34. If you're using the blue ESV Bible and the seatbacks out there, you can find our text on page 15, spilling on over to page 16. The title of our sermon is The Everlasting God. How do you handle conflict? How do you handle conflict in your life, in your family, in your small group, in the church, at work, with your next door neighbor? How do you handle conflict when it arises? Do you tend to be on the more passive side of the spectrum or the more aggressive side of the spectrum, or perhaps everyone's favorite, the passive-aggressive side? You know, most of us we likely don't wake up each morning, or probably any morning, simply brimming with hope that we are going to find ourselves in conflict later that day. I would wager that none of you have ever stood in line at the store just hoping to be accused by the cashier of stealing something. You probably don't drive home from work just pleading with the Lord that your family will be in complete disarray, livid with one another when you walk in the door. Right? Now, I think it is true that maybe not at a conscious level, there are some people who seem to live for conflict, but most of us, we simply want to avoid it. And yet, conflict seems to find us on the regular. And so we come to a passage like this one here in Genesis 21, and while it is not the only word that the Bible gives us about how we might handle conflict, it is a most helpful guide for us. But even more fundamentally than simply serving as a guide for how you deal with conflict resolution in a fallen world, Genesis 21 teaches us something fundamentally about living in the world as we keep our eyes fixed, as the author to the Hebrews says, on the city that is to come. And so I trust that by the time we're done, that we are done, that will be evident to you. But let me read the passage now and then give a brief outline, and then we'll get working on it. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me, and with the land where you have sojourned." And Abraham said, "I will swear." When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, "I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today." So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart?" He said, "These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well." Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. Well, there are 3 things that we need to consider together this morning from this text in verses 22 through 24. We see that Abimelech seeks a peace agreement with Abraham. And then in verses 25 through 32, we see Abraham confront Abimelech about a wrong that had been done to him, and they make covenant together. And then third, in 33 through 34, we see Abraham worship the everlasting God. And so look with me at verses 22 through 24, where we see a peace agreement sought between Abraham and Abimelech. This text begins in verse 22 with the words, "at that time." That refers to the general time of Abraham's banishing of Hagar and Ishmael from his company, from sending them away for the sake of the promise that God had made regarding Isaac, which we considered last week. It was at this time, roughly, that the following scene unfolds. Abimelech, whom we met in chapter 20, he comes to Abraham with the commander of his army, and he acknowledges to Abraham that God is with him whatever he does. And this maps on quite well to what we've seen in Abraham's life. Abraham's acts of faith, as well as moments that could fairly be described as unbelief, disobedience, they have still ultimately, because of God's promise to Abraham, they have only really led to blessing for the patriarch. And we've noted, again, that this isn't because God is indifferent to what Abraham does, whether what he does is always right or always wrong, but because God had made a promise to Abraham for the sake of the families of the earth, and he was going to keep that promise. And yet, in regards to Abimelech in particular, Abraham had lied to him in chapter 20, and it had been quite painful for Abimelech and his household. And so he shows up here in chapter 21 with something that seems to be perhaps a show of force. He's not making an outright threat, but he is perhaps coming prepared just in case anything goes down. He brings the commander of his army with him, and he asks Abraham, the liar from chapter 20, to swear an oath to him that he wouldn't deal falsely with him, that he wouldn't deal falsely with his descendants, or with anything regarding the land. And so he entreats Abraham to remember how Abimelech had been kind to him. He had dealt kindly with him, because even after the lie was exposed and Abimelech confronts him, he gives him basically his take your pick of the land, is what he says. And so Abraham agrees to swear an oath that he will deal kindly and truthfully with Abimelech. But before he does that, he has something of a bone to pick with him. And so now we see, moving into verses 25 through 32, we see this conflict over the land that has really already been brewing, but it comes to something of a head here. He agrees to swear the oath, but there's a grievance between them that he wishes to address before proceeding. Now, in the ESV, it reads in verse 25, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that his servants had seized. And I admit that this is, I think, maybe not the most helpful way this could have been translated. It kind of sounds like there's a substantial amount of time, or at least some amount of time that has passed between this. He swears an oath, and then sometime later he says to him this thing about the well. But if you read in not every single other version, but many other versions, translations, that it's really just, this is his response. He says, hey, I will swear, but Abraham reproved him about a well of water. And so it's part of this whole ordeal. He says, I will swear to this matter, but we need to settle one other thing first. Your men stole something from me. Now, as something of an aside, isn't this the kind of thing that governments are always doing? Samuel thought so in 1 Samuel 8. He warns Israel about the disappointment that they would face when they got their king, and he would take everything from them. Here was a well that Abraham had worked hard to establish for himself and for his people, and in swoop government agents and take it from him. Now, as infuriating as that is, Abraham's response here is actually pretty instructive for us. Rather than going after Abimelech's men who stole the well from him, as he plausibly could have done that. We saw what he did in chapter 14. He went after 4 armies of these eastern kings, defeated them handedly, and brought back the captives and the spoils. And so there's no real sense that yes, he might be 25 years older now, 100 years old, but in terms of his whole household, it's not obvious that he couldn't have done something like that with Abimelech's men. But instead, he decides to handle the matter as peacefully as possible. And even to this point, perhaps he has been willing to overlook the matter. We don't know how long ago the well had been seized. He only seems to bring it up in response to Abimelech's desire for this peace treaty. And so he's been neither faking peace, pretending like nothing happened here, but he's not breaking it either by slaughtering the men and taking the well back. But he perhaps had been willing to let it go. But now that Abimelech wants this formal relationship between them, he needs to address it. And so he does. And Abimelech, we may assume, says truthfully, I had no idea about this. First I'm hearing of it, Abraham. I don't know who did it. You didn't tell me about it, and I haven't heard anything else about it until today. There's no particular reason to think that Abimelech would be lying about this. And so he says this, and that seems to at some level settle the matter for Abraham. And so they proceed with the ritual. Abraham brings cattle and sheep to Abimelech for the oath. They covenant together. Now, making covenants was common custom in the ancient Near East, but this is the first time that Genesis describes a covenant between two humans. So far, what we've seen with the covenantal language has been between God and a person. And so now we have two humans making covenant together. And yet in this covenant, Abraham isn't merely interested in promising to tell the truth from now on. He still wants to resolve the matter of the well. And so in it, he sets aside 7 female lambs. And Abimelech asks, well, what's the meaning of this? What's going on with these lambs that are different from the rest of the herd that you've brought out? And he says, well, they are here, and they are meant to stand as a witness for Abraham that he had dug the well. And in some ways, this is a bit strange. Abraham dug the well. Abraham brought the cattle and the sheep for the covenant. Why is he now taking some of them and purposefully setting them aside, to purchase this well that had been stolen from him? Well, as we've seen, rather than merely returning violence with violence, Abraham is seeking diplomacy here to resolve the issue. By confronting Abimelech about the well, he put him in something of a tight spot, right? Think about it. Abimelech's servants, what might they have said? Whoa, we didn't steal anything from this guy. They may have been telling him that Abraham was lying. Was Abimelech really to believe this foreigner over his own men? This foreigner who, don't forget Abimelech, he just lied to you, the presumably only other encounter that they had had. Well, by providing Abimelech with these 7 lambs, as they swore this oath, Abraham secures a public concession from Abimelech regarding the well. It's Abraham's. We relinquish any claim on it, and it provides Abimelech a way possibly to save face in front of his men. As one author put it this way, instead of fighting Abimelech or insisting on Abimelech giving back control of the well simply at his word that he had dug it, Abraham provides a graceful way out. He gives Abimelech 7 lambs so Abimelech can tell his servants, the well's been purchased. Abraham gets his well back. Abimelech's servants save face. Abimelech avoids contention within his ranks, and all is well. This might be something akin to what Sun Tzu's Golden Bridge of Retreat, right? It's a strategic maneuver in conflict that allows an enemy or potential enemy an appealing way of avoiding further conflict. Rather than insisting on his right here over the well and threatening violence to get it back, Abraham tactfully negotiates the situation so that all things considered, everybody wins. And so they make this covenant together. And the place where they covenant and swear this oath, it's given this name Beersheba. And there's a lot that we could say about this name. It comes up later on in the Bible. Beersheba becomes sort of a synonym for the southernmost border of the Promised Land. But what's important, I think, to note here is that there's something of a play on words in the name. So Beer means well, so a well that was dug, and Sheba means either oath or seven. It can mean either of those. And so they named the place Beersheba, meaning something like, probably because their oath concerns a well, so the place is named the well of the oath, and it's also named this way because of the witness of the 7 ewe lambs, the well of the 7. And so they covenant together, and then they part ways. And we see then a third thing here in verses 33 and 34. We see the conclusion of the matter. Abimelech and Phicol have returned to the land of the Philistines. The Philistines as a people proper do not yet exist at this point, and so it's really just saying that that's the general area from which they will come later on. I don't know that it's so much a comment about the personal character of Abimelech or the commander of his army, but it just situates them geographically. The focus of this narrative, the end of it here, is not on Abimelech, but it's on Abraham. And Abraham does 3 things here. He plants a tree, he worships, and he sojourns in the land of the Philistines. Now, we've already seen trees a few times in Genesis, even in the Abrahamic narrative. Abraham worshiped God at the oak of Moreh in Shechem. That was in Genesis 12:7. He lived by the oaks of Mamre near Hebron in 13:18. He supped with Yahweh and 2 angels under one of those oaks, presumably in 18:8. And now he plants a tamarisk tree in Beersheba here in verse 33. Now, back in Genesis 12:7, when he worshiped God at the oak of Moreh, and he built an altar there. And so there was this explicit worship, calling on the name of the Lord. Here, we're not told that he builds an altar. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But he plants this tree, which may very well be similar to the idea of building an altar, perhaps, and he worships God. Now, Genesis, beyond just Abraham's narrative, is really brimming with arboreal language. In particular, we think back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. The worship of Yahweh at a tree in Genesis, right, should never be too far removed from our thoughts regarding Eden. And when we come to this passage in Genesis 21 with Abraham calling on the name of the Lord, we recognize that much has changed in the world since that day in the garden when man rebelled against his maker at a tree. But do you know what hasn't changed? You know what hasn't changed an iota from that moment to this one when Abraham is worshiping God? God hasn't changed. He didn't change at all. He hasn't changed from then to then and from then to now. Think about what Isaiah 40 says in verses 28 and 29. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. The pastoral prayer I prayed from Psalm 90, everlasting to everlasting. The Lord is God. Through the ups and downs of Abraham's life, God has proven himself faithful and unchanging. And this is the lesson that he learned in the casting off of Ishmael. It wasn't Abraham's idea. That wasn't something that he particularly wanted to do. Initially, he was quite unsettled in his heart about sending his son away. But God promised to protect his son, to provide for him. And then immediately on the heels of that, who knows what exactly his emotional state would have been. Was he perfectly settled in his heart about sending away Ishmael when Abimelech strolls up? He gets into this conflict with Abimelech. He has to swear to him, but then he's got this issue with the well that needs addressed. And yet, because of his faith in the Lord, his trust in the everlasting God, he's able to maneuver his way through this with integrity and charity. Something that in his last interaction with Abimelech, he didn't exactly demonstrate. And he comes to the end of all of this with his faith still firmly rooted in God. And so he worships the everlasting God. And this is something that will prove unbelievably significant beyond measure for Abraham right around the corner. Because you know what happens right after this? In Genesis 22:1, after these things, God tested Abraham. The biggest test of his entire life is right around the corner from him. And so it is especially good that he has been reminded that God is unchanging, that God is forever, that God is the everlasting God. And so he plants this tree, he worships the everlasting God, and by doing so, he proclaims the faithfulness of God. He is trusting in his promise. He's placing all his hope in him. Right? You wouldn't plant a tree in your neighbor's yard. And so Abraham is planting this slow-growing tree kind of in his neighbor's yard as a sign of faith and the promise that God had made to him concerning the land. He has received the son of promise. He now plants a tree in the land of promise as a sign, a picture of the way in which this seed will become a great nation. And he sojourns in the land of the Philistines, we're told. And that place was not his home. It wasn't necessarily a brief stay, but it wasn't a permanent one either. And so I have several ideas, several things that I want to consider with you here before we close in terms of lessons to draw from a passage like this. The first one comes back to how we began the sermon, a question about conflict. It teaches us some things about how we navigate and negotiate conflict with one another. It doesn't teach us everything we need to know about conflict, but it does set forward a few principles, one of which, peace, generally preferable to war. We've noted Abraham, he's peaceable and he's wise in his approach to Abimelech. Abimelech's men had wronged him. They had wrongfully seized this well that he and his men had dug, and yet rather than marching up to them and making for war, which, again, based on Genesis 14, it was at least a feasible option for him. But instead of doing that, he seeks peace rather than conflict. Now, in Genesis 14, when Abraham engaged in that conflict with the eastern kings, there's a difference, and I think that's at least part of this, right? Some people had already clearly died in that conflict. Others were taken captive. But here in Genesis 21, there was indeed an act of aggression. There was a wrongful seizure of a well, but perhaps, at least as far as we can tell, no human life had been cut short at this point. And so it seemed good and right to Abraham to seek an agreement that wouldn't cost any more human life to settle and to prevent further feuding with Abimelech or others in the land. And this is a commendable path for us to follow whenever we are able, whether we're dealing with officially sanctioned government agents or not. Right? The best path in the midst of conflict is typically the one that promotes the most peace, does the least amount of damage. Paul exhorts the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 13, he says, aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Now you may hear that and say, well, he's talking about amongst fellow Christians. But he also says to the Romans, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Now, of course, we should admit that Abimelech was, from all we know, the kind of man who makes such agreement possible. And so there's another lesson to learn here. Know your audience. Abimelech had already demonstrated himself to be a man of integrity. And so in addition to the Bible's general admonition toward peaceful resolutions in conflict, it would have been utterly foolish for Abraham to engage in open war with this man and his kingdom, since he'd already demonstrated at some level that he was honest and reasonable. Would Abraham have handled the well dispute differently if Abimelech was an incorrigible ingrate? And that Abimelech was known as a man always looking to go to fisticuffs. He was always ready to throw down. Maybe. But it certainly appeared possible to live peaceably with him, and so he sought it out. We see a third lesson about conflict here. Abraham didn't roll over and let Abimelech's men walk all over him. He confronted the issue with Abimelech. He didn't stew on it in silence forever, holding a grudge against Abimelech to his dying day. He didn't let it subtly eat away at every further interaction that they had, but he confronted him. And seemingly was willing to take him at his word that he had no prior knowledge of it. And so, how do we bring some of this together about maybe one central point about conflict? Here's two sentences that I think sum it up well. We should confront sin when it occurs, and we should establish expectations that aim to prevent further sins in the future, and we should do this peacefully rather than through force whenever possible. We should confront sin when it occurs and establish expectations that aim to prevent further sins in the future, and we should do this peacefully rather than through force whenever possible. But we also learn something about culture here. Abraham is presented as an earthy man in Genesis. By that, I don't mean a man of the dirt per se, but he's a cultural man. He's not hiding under a rock. He's engaged with the world around him. I read this summary of Abraham somewhere this week. Abraham is shown in Genesis so far to be a prophet, a warrior, a defense attorney in his argument with God, a husband, a father, a farmer, a rancher, a vassal king, a hydraulic engineer, construction foreman, horticulturist, culturalist, gardener, and architect. He's a man of many interests, in part because he's a man of necessity. Look, I'm a huge fan of the diversification of labor. And so I'm really happy that I don't have to be all of those things in order to survive or even thrive today. But we see modeled in Abraham here and the rest of the Bible that God's people are not called to retreat from the world in some kind of hermit-like huddle. Right? I don't have to know anything about hydraulic engineering, praise the Lord, in order to make it in this life. But I am well permitted to pursue a variety of interests and skill sets in the world. God's people are free to develop skills, to use them in the world in such a way that promotes the flourishing of humanity. And this is what we see in Abraham here. He engages in culture, he builds a well, even engages in politics. He covenants with King Abimelech. Well, there's one other key thing that he does here, the heart of all this. He worships. He engages in the world. He engages in culture and politics. But he's not fundamentally political or worldly. Fundamentally, Abraham is a worshiper. He seeks peaceful living among the pagan inhabitants of the land, but he's not particularly interested in political reform. Now, the question for us may be, well, that's great for him, but what's that got to do with us today? I think there's a substantial difference between Abraham and us, as well as a substantial similarity between us. First, the difference. Abraham is living prior to the resurrection. While God was king even then, and everlastingly so, Jesus had not yet legally reclaimed every square inch of the globe by means of his resurrection from the dead and sent his church into the world to make disciples of all nations. This isn't the case for us. We're living on this side of the resurrection, and Jesus has commanded us to go and to make disciples of all nations. And so no matter what place on earth we live, including this one right here in Lincoln, Georgia, Jesus Christ is the unrivaled Lord of all creation. But there is a similarity that we share with Abraham here. Hebrews 11, 9 through 10 says, by faith we went to live in the land of promise. He went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. We read a few verses later in 13 to 17 that the faithful descendants of Abraham likewise desired a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And then in Hebrews 13:14 we read, "Here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." And what's the conclusion then that he draws from this, the author to the Hebrews? We, like Abraham, we have no lasting city here. Christians, through Jesus, ought to, he says, offer up a sacrifice of praise. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. In other words, as Peter says in 1 Peter 1:17 through 19, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. So we aren't necessarily called to drive out political rivals every chance we get, or to make every nation a Christian one. That may in fact be something that some Christians throughout history will see come to pass and perhaps see come and go. But the enduring message to God's people throughout history, no matter how Christian or pagan their society is live faithfully before God. Because we seek the city that is to come, we can continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. Even as exiles in the world, we can continually call upon the name of the Lord, because we know that while the earth, when it is renewed in the eschaton, it will be our forever home, we are not yet living in that reality. And yet that doesn't lead us to retreat into self-protective ghettos and into irrelevance. In fact, like we saw with Abraham, he planted a tree in the promised land that he did not yet own. He did it in hope for the day when God would give it to his children. And so now, Christians, we live as exiles in the world, yet the world has been promised to us. And so we can plant and we can build and we can develop and we can grow in the hope for the day when, as Jesus said, the meek inherit the earth. We're living in turbulent times. Power struggles continue to wreak havoc on individuals, families, churches, communities, governments around the country and the world, especially as the centralized might of the American government grows out of control. So what do? What does it mean to live in the world as we long for the city that is to come? Well, it probably means a lot of things, but here's something that I want to focus on as we begin to land the plane here. We should take up prayer. We must pray. Paul, in 1 Timothy 2, he instructs Timothy, really instructs the Ephesians through Timothy to pray, he says, for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions. Why? So that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Right? He doesn't say pray for them so that our political rivals will be vanquished. He says pray for them so that we may lead quiet and peaceful lives. But this silence and solitude is not an end in itself so that I get to just do whatever I want. He says it is good for us to have quiet and peaceful lives, and it pleases God who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God. In other words, do we want those around us to be saved, to come to know this one God through Jesus Christ? Of course, but that doesn't happen at the end of a sword. At least it does the sword of the Spirit and with prayer. But he goes on from there in chapter 2 in 1 Timothy to exhort Timothy to instruct the Ephesians to be peaceful and respectable in their living. In particular, he has an eye toward their worship. He urges the men to put off violence and to put on holiness. He urges the women to put off immodesty and to put on that which is proper for women who profess godliness, good works. So we ought to pray for our leaders. And of course, there are times when Christians will find themselves in high political positions and should rule according to Scripture and their conscience. But the overall thrust of the Bible's message to us, Old Testament or New Testament, is not to make power in general or even political power our ultimate aim. Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man in whom there is no salvation. When his breath departs, he returns to the earth. On that very day, his plans perish. Rather, blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God. Abraham planted a tree and he worshiped God in a foreign land in the hope of the coming day when God would give the land to his descendants. I saw this week one author very helpfully connect this act of planting this tree in Beersheba by Abraham. Saw this connected with what we, the children of Abraham, by faith, do each Lord's Day. We gather together as believers in covenant community, the church. We stand in our respective cities and towns as heirs, not simply of a land in Beersheba, but, as the Apostle Paul reminds us, as heirs of the entire world. Romans 4:13. We as a church rejoice not in the anticipation of the promised son of Abraham, but in the actual coming of him. We too rejoice and are glad in our Savior. And so we stand as children of the promise, but nevertheless as aliens in a foreign land with promises yet to come. We declare the greatness of our covenant-keeping, everlasting God. That is what we are doing here each week when we gather. We're declaring the greatness of our covenant-keeping God, the everlasting God. And so how do we handle conflict? Well, we seek for peace, and we look with faith to God who makes and keeps covenant. And so, brothers and sisters, let us once more together look to the everlasting God, who is Lord over all. Look to Jesus Christ, at whose name every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord, even as we remember that that day is not yet here. So we struggle on in faith, looking to the city which is to come and to its maker, the everlasting God.